So welcome again to the Moveworks Agentic Automation Engine webinar. This week, we're going to be doing Stripe payment lookups and refund management. So allowing users to look up all the balance transactions in Stripe as well as trigger a refund for an existing transaction. And then we have some disparate system webinars coming up for Slack and Google Calendar, PagerDuty, and HubSpot. For today's agenda, we're going to do a walkthrough of what agentic automation is, how it works. We're going to talk about what a Stripe payment and refund management use case should look like from a user experience perspective. And then we're going to go ahead and build it out. And then we'll have a Q&A session at the end. So let's preface this with talking about building on the new Moveworks agentic automation engine. So the Moveworks agentic automation engine is constructed of a lot of separate components. It's all built on top of Moveworks agentic reasoning engine. So this is the engine that allows Moveworks to discern when a user asks a question, what is the right type of response that they're looking for of the available functions that the Moveworks bot has available to it, and what of those responses is the most likely to help them get resolution for their issue. On top of the reasoning engine, we have the manifest generator, the plugin execution engine, and the action orchestrator. This is a combination of functionality that allows us to understand the API responses that we get back when we make a call to an endpoint system, allows Moveworks to select the right plugin from all of the ones that we have created, both in Agentic Automation, Creator Studio, as well as the native plugins that exist within Moveworks, making sure that the one, again, that is the most likely to resolve the issue is the one that's actually selected, and then the action orchestrator handling the actual changes that are made or the calls that are made to endpoint systems. The plugins themselves, so the use cases that we're building, have some functionality built into them as well. So triggers, that is the language that users can leverage to get that use case to be initialized. So the types of questions that we expect people to ask, where the use case that we're building is the correct solution for them. Slot resolvers is the ability for the LLM to interpret which portions of a user's question are relevant for the API call that needs to be made to the system. So if I say I need information on customer XYZ, the slot resolver pulls XYZ out of that question, resolves that slot in the API, makes sure that it grabs the information for the right resource. Policy validator, so that's making sure that we have valid inputs for when we build our workflows, and then actions and activities, the actual steps that we take when we interact with the API. So what can we use an agentic automation plugin to do? We can build an action, and then we can chain multiple actions into a single flow. So this allows us to utilize the response that we get back from a prior action and manipulate it and utilize it in follow-up actions. We can define the payload schema. So what should the call that we get back from the API look like, and what should the call that we send back out to the Moveworks look like? We can write scripts. So we can leverage Python. We have some built-in coding tools and operators that we can leverage. We're going to see some examples of that today. And we can prompt the model using natural language. So on top of building the action, we can also insert a prompt into the model when we build the action to help dictate the response that it gives back to the user. We're also going to do that in our demo today. So this is how we should think about an agentic automation use case at the highest level. So from the bottom, we have the action. This is the individual relationship between Moveworks and an API endpoint. So with our use case today, we want to be able to get all of the transaction balances that are available in Stripe, and then we also want to be able to trigger a refund on those. So those are going to be two independent actions. One action is going to be getting all of those transactions. Another action is going to be being able to refund one of those transactions. We can then promote each of these actions to a plugin. It is also possible to concatenate the flow of actions into a compound action, which is a series of actions that, again, we can manipulate the payload between them, do whatever enhancements or data cleanup that we need to do. For today's session, because we want to be able to return the list of transactions back to the users and then allow them to refund a payment for it, we are not going to build those into a compound action. They're going to be two distinctly separate actions, where one is a slot resolver for the second. We'll talk about that in more detail when we get to that point, but just to know that if you're building actions where at some point in the flow, you need to return a list or some information back to the user and then have them make a decision based on that information. You're not going to want to build that as a compound action. Anytime you need to return out back to the user, you're going to want to end the flow there. So that's why it's going to be two distinctly separate actions in today's session. So what should the user experience for a flow like this look like? I want to be able to show the user all of the transactions that we currently have open in our Stripe instance, and then I want them to be able to select a transaction or refund. So I expect them to come in and say, show me all the open transactions in Stripe, show me our Stripe transactions, show me what transaction balances we have open for customers, something to that effect. When they ask that, we're going to query the Stripe API for the existing balance transactions, and Moveworks will return that it is attempting to grab them, and then it will return the information that it actually gets back from the system. Based on that response, we want the user to then be able to ask for a refund. So in this case, we see that we have a company dinner event and we have a new iPad. The user asks for a refund on that iPad. So they're referring to the response that they got back from that initial action that was created. And using slot resolvers, we're able to grab the charge ID, which is what the Stripe API requires to process a refund, and use that information and process the refund for the user, let them know that that charge has been refunded. So let's hop into our demo for today. So I'm going to go into my Moveworks instance. I'm going to go to Creator Studio, and I'm going to go to my actions. So remember, when we are building a new use case, we're going to go bottom to top in this UI. So we're going to need to build our initial action. We're going to create the workflow in our compound actions module, and then we'll promote it to a plugin to make it available to users, as well as decide what the triggering language is going to be. So I'm going to create a new plugin. And then I'm going to base this creation upon my interaction with the actual API for Stripe. So I have a Stripe instance. I have a lot of balance transactions that are available in that Stripe instance, and I want Moveworks to be able to grab them. So I need to make sure that I have an API key available. I understand how the Stripe API works to the extent that I need to use it. And I'm able to, either in Postman or in my terminal using a curl request, able to grab the transactions that I would want to be able to present back to the user. And now we just need to translate this into our Moveworks action. So I have my API endpoint. I have my API key, which is going to be a key value pair where we have authorization and then a bearer token. And that's really all I need to authenticate in this endpoint and get my information back. So we're going to take our base URL and our endpoint URL. So our base URL is going to be everything up to the end of the instance name. And then our endpoint URL is going to be the actual endpoint that we're trying to reach with the call that we're making right now. This is going to be a GET request, and then I need an auth config. So we're using API key auth, and then we're using header auth. I know that I'm using header auth because to actually authenticate into this, I need to have this authorization header here, and it needs to be of this type bearer. So I'm going to input that here. So authorization, bearer, and then I'm going to do a %s. So this will carry the string from the defined API key into this value so that it's in the same syntax that we have in our Postman environment. And then I'm going to enter the API key here. Because this is just a simple GET request for returning all the transactions, I actually don't need to input a header, parameters, body, input variables. I can just test it. And we get a response back, and we can see that that response matches what we have in Postman. So I'm now getting back the transactions that I want to be able to show the user. So I'm going to save this. So my connector name is going to be Stripe get transaction. API name is just going to name these the same thing. So I have my Stripe get transaction. So now I'm going to go to compound actions, going to create a new action. You're going to want to make sure that the compound action name and description are well formed, meaning that they are illustrative of what this use case is actually going to do, because these are actually utilized in the LLM when it is trying to decide which plugin should be triggered when a user asks a question. So having this be well formed is helpful not only to yourself to remember what it is for, to other developers in your instance that they understand what it's being utilized for, but also for the LLM to actually prompt it correctly. And now we are in our script editor. So this is where we're going to build the end-to-end logic for how we're going to pull this information from the API endpoint. So the first thing that we need to do is define our steps. So these are the steps that we're going to take when this workflow is called. And then we're going to have some action. And then that action name is going to be the one that we just created. So it's going to be Stripe get transactions. So that's a little bit cleaner. I don't need to have that second action name. Okay. So we have our action, Stripe get transactions. So that's the action that we've just defined. We have some progress update for on complete on pending. These are referenced to underlying ones. So I'm going to want to update this to be a little bit more well formed. So Stripe balance transactions retrieved. Okay. And then we have some output key. That output key is Stripe get transactions results. So this output key is a container for the response that we're getting back from the API, right? So if we imagine this as being a single object, which it is, we now have a name for this object, which is Stripe get transactions results. So what we're doing in this workflow is we're making our get call that we define in our actions for the balances that are available. We're defining the language that the bot is going to use when it talks to the user about what's going on after this use case is triggered. And then we're going to capture that in this output key. Now that we have all that, what we want to do is we want to return. So what we're going to need to do is return an output mapper. And the output mapper is just how we define the schema for our return object. And then what we're going to want to do is create a map. So the reason that I'm creating a map is because I am getting a list of objects back from the API. So under data here, we can see that I have a list, and in this list, I have several objects, right? So I have this transaction, I have this transaction. What I want to be able to do is I want to be able to iterate through this list of objects, and I want to be able to pull only the information I care about, which is going to be primarily the amount and the description. So I've defined my map. I'm going to go and I'm going to use a converter. So the converter is just required as part of this mapping function. And then I'm going to map some of these fields. So I have the description, I'm going to map that to item.description. And for clarity, the way that we're iterating through this is we have some list of items. And then items is going to be a reference to get transactions result dot data. So the reason for the syntax, why can't I just say, okay, my output key is stripe get transaction result, so I'm going to reference stripe get transaction result. The reason that we need to do data dot is because data is the global parent object for when we pass information between actions in our compound action workflow editor. So if I want to pass an output key from one action to another, it's going to be contained within data. I'm going to need to access it within data. And then it just so happens that in our API response, we have another data object, and that data object is the list that we want to iterate through. So the data on this side is a reference to the resulting, the API response that we got back from Stripe and making sure that we're iterating through that list. So this will iterate through every item in that list and make sure that the LLM has the description available to it. Again, I want to add some additional fields here. So I'm going to do type, reference to the type field within each of these. Charge source, item source. Okay. So this will return all of the items in that list, and it will make sure that all of these attributes are mapped for each item where those values exist. Another thing that we could do here is we could filter on these results. So there's two types of transactions that we have here. One is a refund type, which is what we're targeting for the next action. And then the other is a charge. So if I search by type, see refund, 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 charge.
Okay, I found this on the web.
So if I wanted to filter it, I could do something like this, where I have my list, I have an item within that list, and then I'm going to do a lambda function where I'm going to say item.type is not equal to refund. So what this would do is for every item in that list where the item type is not refund, we're going to populate this object that we're going to have available to give back to the user. If the type is refund, then it will not be included. It will get filtered out. So in the response to the user, it won't include any of those refunds. So if we need to filter down the list that we get back from the API to only include something that's relevant, this is the way that we can do it. In this case, I do just want to get all of this information back. So I'm going to remove the filter. I'm going to save this. And now I'm going to publish this workflow to a plugin. And this is what's going to actually allow me to utilize it. And then this is what language should a user be able to utilize to trigger this use case. So I'm going to say, go there. It'll figure it out, not to worry. And then I'm going to launch this just to myself since I'm a developer and I'm just testing this for now. Ready to be launched in production. That just captures the analytics. Not really helpful to us right now, so I'm just going to leave it. Okay. So I published that. Should be available to me here within a couple minutes. But it's only half of what we're actually trying to do, right? I also want people to be able to refund. So let's build that out quickly. That way, when we do our demo, we could really do it end to end. So our authorization is going to be the same. So I should have some Stripe connector in here. This is my get transactions connector. I have all my authorization. That's going to be the same. I'm going to have a body here. So the body is going to be charge source. So this is something that we defined in our workflow for the get transactions. So the charge source is actually going to be the ID of the underlying charge. So when we process a refund through Stripe, we need to make sure that we have the ID of the charge, and then we process the refund through the charge ID. So I have a charge ID that is existing. I'm going to put that as my input variable. So this allows me to test it. So it's going to plug in this example value into the body when it sends this test API call. And then the URL for the refund is just /v1/refunds, and then this is going to be post. So we did get a 400 back. The reason that we got a 400 back is because this particular transaction has already been refunded. So the API itself is working. If this were a proper charge ID, we'd be fine here. So I'm just going to save this as is. And then my name here. So the reason that the 400 here isn't really a big deal is because I know that the API is working or else I wouldn't have received that error. And for the refund, all that really matters that we show back to the user is whether or not it succeeded. So if we get a 400 back, we know that didn't succeed. The LLM will see, okay, the API response is telling me this transaction has already been refunded. I'm going to tell the user that. Or in the case where the transaction has not been refunded, um, and it actually goes through the process, it will say, okay, I've refunded that transaction for you based on the 200 response that it gets back from the API. So I'm going to go in, I'm going to create a new workflow. The compound action name, Stripe, um, refund transactions. Okay, and then since we're low on time here, I'm just going to throw this in here. So, uh, okay, so we have, like we did in the last use case, we have our output key. So this is what we're carrying between the initial action and a return output mapper. We have the action names. This is referencing that post call that we just made. We have our progress updates, and then we have our input argument. So this is the only meaningful difference here. So the input argument is the charge source. So again, that's the ID that we need to be able to refund properly. And the way that we're grabbing this is actually from the prior use case. So when a user asks for all of that transaction data. So I'm going to submit this. And then I'm going to promote this to a plugin. And then I'm going to try and capture language that I expect my users to utilize when they need to process a refund. So how do I initiate a refund transaction for Stripe? All of these I think are valid. And we're going to capture these from our end users and any existing tickets that we have in our environment for when people have requested this in the past. I'm going to open this for myself. Yeah, I'm not going to launch it in production because that's just for analytics purposes. Okay. So I've launched my use cases. So now I'm going to go to my Moveworks bot. I'm going to make sure that I can interact with it. I'm going to say hi. And then I'm going to try and trigger my use case. So it's currently retrieving that information. It's going through the workflow that we developed. It's going to be processing it. And then it does seem like there was an error. So let me go to my logs here. Root. So this is most likely going to be some kind of syntax error that we had. So I'm going to go back in my workflow, return all transactions. Get transaction results. So very likely there's a syntactical issue with this return statement. I'm just going to copy one that I had prior. Essentially the same. Stripe transactions. I'm going to update this key. Stripe get transactions. And then the rest of this looks fine to me. Going to check my action, make sure that everything about this is still working and makes sense, which it is. Okay. I'm going to check this and make sure that I'm actually accessing it properly. Then I'm going to take one of these to make sure that it's triggering correctly. Then I'm going to go back into my bot. I'm going to do Copilot clear history so that it doesn't reference the prior context where it already tried and failed to do this action. I'm going to try it again. Okay. So it returned a bunch of our transactions that existed in Stripe. So we can see that it broke it up into two categories. One is refunds, one is charges. And then the additional step is I want to be able to refund an existing charge. So I could say, can you refund Christian's Model S testing? So it shows refunding Stripe transaction, which implies that it hit the right plugin. So what's going on in the background here is it's making the call to the Stripe API, but what it's really doing that is important is the slot resolution aspect of it. So it's not shown here, but one of the things that it captures when it pulls these results back again is that charge ID. So even though it's not showing it to me as an end user, under this line item where we have the amount description and date available for Krishna's Model S Tesla, the LLM also has access to the charge ID associated with that. So when I ask it to refund that Model S Tesla, it references the transaction ID, which it should grab from okay. One thing that we needed to add here is a charge source. So the charge source is, again, that charge ID. So this is how we had defined it in the prior one. Charge source. And then this is just going to be a string. So without that, the LLM, when the workflow went through, it wasn't actually processing the charge source that it got from the return all transactions. So if I go back into here, again, the key item that we want it to be able to use to slot resolve is this item.source. I defined it here, but I had not actually defined it in my refund input fields, so it essentially got dropped. So I'm going to try this operation one more time. I'm going to do compile clear history. Going to ask it to show me all of the existing transactions. And okay. And now that we have fixed that charge source reference in the workflow editor, we expect that this is going to be able to do that slot resolution, and it's going to be able to process this request without me as the end user having to actually pull that charge ID in some way and then supply it. Did you realize that we're over time? So this update has been successfully refunded. So that means that we got a 200 response back from the API. We created that refund object in the Stripe API, and that transaction is now refunded. So took a little bit longer than we would have liked, but in 37 minutes, we built a use case that allows the user to get all the transactions existing in Stripe, return to them, and refund those based on a selection. So I'm going to go through this next section fairly quickly, but how to learn more, please, please, please take the Creator Studio Developer Certification course. This is really the best entry point into using Creator Studio and using agentic automation. All the concepts within the Creator Studio Developer Certification carry over pretty much one-to-one within agentic automation engine. So please go through those videos, make sure that you understand those concepts. Also, review and engage in the documentation and developer community. So our developer and doc site is pretty well formed. Please visit it for any questions that you have or anything that doesn't make sense as you're iterating through the UI or use cases that you're trying to build. See if we have existing documentation for it. If not, reach out to your customer success team. And then post in our developer community. So we have an active developer forum where you can go in, ask questions, get answers from people on my team, the customer success engineering team, as well as the product team and other customer engineers who are working on use cases like these. And finally, I want to open it up or if anybody has any questions. Okay. I know we were a little over, so thank you everyone for the extra time. Have a great day and thank you for joining.